Prepare for a terrifying tale. Welcome, dear listeners, to a tale not meant for the faint of heart. The night is long, the dead are restless, and the whispers never truly fade. What you are about to hear is not just a story. It is a descent into darkness, a chilling account of horror that will claw its way into your mind and linger long after the final word. This is Night of the Undead. I am Dr. Sinister, your gracious host, and this tale is for mature audiences only. Smash the likes, subscribe to the channel, and proceed, if you dare. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly as Daniel wiped down the counter. The gas station was dead. No customers, no cars, just the hum of an old refrigerator and the occasional rustle of wind against the glass doors. He glanced at the clock. 11:56 p.m. 4 more minutes and he'd be out of here, back to his one-bedroom apartment where a cold beer and a rerun of some B-movie horror flick were waiting. The door chime startled him. A man stumbled inside, his coat damp from the rain that had been falling on and off all evening. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted around the store, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. "We're closing soon," Daniel said, nodding toward the clock. The man didn't respond. He took a few slow steps forward, his breathing ragged. His lips moved, whispering something under his breath. Daniel frowned. "You okay, man? Need me to call someone?" The man finally locked eyes with him and Daniel's stomach knotted. There was something wrong with him. Not just exhaustion, but something deeper. Fear. Pure, bone-deep terror. "It won't stop," the man whispered. "The night. It won't stop." Daniel took a step back, glancing toward the security camera, as if it could somehow explain what the hell was going on. "What are you talking about?" The man grabbed his wrist, his grip ice cold. "They're already here. You just haven't seen them yet." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He yanked his arm free. "Look, buddy, you need to..." The lights flickered, just for a second, a brief pulse of darkness that made his breath hitch. The man let out a whimper and staggered toward the glass doors, peering outside. The gas station lot was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the streetlights. Then, Daniel saw them, a group of figures standing just beyond the pumps. At first he thought they were people, but as the flickering lights buzzed overhead, he saw the truth. They weren't human anymore. Their skin was stretched too tight over their skulls, peeling in places, revealing raw, blackened flesh. Some had chunks missing, exposed ribs, open stomachs where intestines hung like rotting vines. Their eyes were sunken pits, filled with writhing black veins. Their mouths, oh God, their mouths, were split wide, filled with jagged, broken teeth that gnashed together as if starving for something alive. And then, as if sensing him, they turned. One let out a guttural snarl, its throat gurgling as thick, dark fluid dripped from its lips. Another twitched violently, its movements erratic, unnatural, like a puppet with its strings yanked by unseen hands. The man in the coat backed away from the door. "It's already too late," he muttered. Daniel's hand drifted toward the baseball bat under the counter. "What the hell are they?" The answer came with a sound, a horrible wet crunch, from the back of the store. The storage room door burst open. Something crawled out. A woman, what was left of one, dragging herself on broken, twisted arms. Her jaw hung slack, her face half-eaten, her eyes glassy and filled with hunger. Her ribs jutted out from her shredded uniform, and her fingers were too long, sharpened bone where nails should have been. A low, rattling breath wheezed from her chest as her head snapped toward him. Daniel barely had time to grab the bat before the first set of rotting hands lunged for him. Daniel and the man who had just walked in stood no chance. The radio crackled with static. Officer Jake Cooper adjusted the volume knob, but all he got was more white noise. He frowned, gripping the steering wheel as he guided his cruiser down the empty stretch of highway leading into town. Dispatch had been silent for the last 20 minutes. That never happened, not in a town this size. At least one drunken idiot should have been causing trouble by now. He slowed as he approached the gas station. The lights were still on, but something about the place felt wrong. A shattered glass door, flickering overhead signs, and an abandoned car still running near the pumps. He reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Cooper. I'm at the Sinclair gas station off Route 12. Something's off here. Requesting backup. Over." Nothing. Just more static. A deep unease settled in his stomach. He unfastened the safety strap on his holster, resting his hand on the grip of his pistol as he stepped out of the car. The moment he did, the scent hit him, blood and rot. He scanned the lot. No movement, no sounds, except the distant hum of the station's flickering lights. Then he saw them, deep wet footprints leading from the gas pumps toward the store. The glass door was splattered with something dark, and inside, aisles were overturned. Shadows danced across the dimly lit interior, shifting unnaturally. Cooper drew his weapon. "This is Officer Cooper. If anyone's inside, identify yourself." No response. He took a cautious step forward, his pulse hammering. The air felt thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. As he pushed through the broken doorway, the scent of decay hit him like a punch to the gut. The first body he saw was barely recognizable. A man in a store uniform, his torso torn open, ribs gleaming beneath mangled flesh. His head was twisted at an unnatural angle, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Something moved in the corner of his vision. He spun, weapon raised, just as one of them stumbled into view. It had once been a man, but now it was a nightmare of rotting flesh and black, hungry eyes. Its jaw hung open too wide, teeth clicking together as it released a grotesque hiss. Cooper didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the store, striking the creature square in the chest. But it didn't stop. It barely even staggered. The thing lurched forward. Cooper fired again, this time hitting its skull. The head snapped back, and for a moment it stood motionless. Then, with a sickening crunch, it took another step. Cold fear gripped him. He took a step back, only to hear a low, guttural moan behind him. He turned just in time to see three more staggering from the shadows. The gas station had become a trap. Cooper fought his way out, barely escaping with his life, bloodied and shaken. He stumbled back to his cruiser, hands trembling as he started the engine. As he peeled out of the lot, the last thing he saw was a horde of the undead emerging from the darkness, watching him go. Cooper wasn't done with this nightmare, not yet. Reverend Thomas Calloway sat in the dim light of the church, his fingers trembling over the well-worn leather of his Bible. The heavy oak doors were locked. The candles flickered on the altar, casting shadows that swayed like specters against the stained glass windows. Outside, the town was silent. The screams had faded hours ago, replaced by a dreadful stillness. He knew they were out there, the dead. His congregation had come to him in desperation. Families huddled in the pews, clutching one another, praying for salvation. He had promised them safety within these sacred walls. But Calloway had seen the truth. The Lord was not listening tonight. A wet, dragging sound echoed from the far end of the church. Calloway's breath caught in his throat. Slowly he turned toward the back of the sanctuary. The heavy wooden pews stretched into the darkness, and in the shadows between them, something moved. The shuffling of rotting limbs against the tile floor. A low, hungry gurgle. Then came the moan. Not human, not anymore. Calloway swallowed hard, gripping his Bible tighter. "We are in the house of God," he whispered. "You have no power here." A figure lurched into the candlelight. It had been Deacon Wilkes. The old man's face was barely recognizable now, his flesh sagging from his skull in blackened, festering patches. His lips had rotted away, leaving jagged teeth bared in an eternal snarl. His milky eyes locked onto Calloway. Behind him, more emerged. The missing, the ones who had fled into the night and never returned. "No," Calloway whispered, stumbling backward. "No, no, no." A woman, her Sunday dress hanging in bloody tatters, twitched violently as she moved toward the altar. A child followed, its tiny hands raw and gnawed, lips moving soundlessly. Their moans blended into a chorus of hunger. The Reverend took a step back, then another. His heel caught on the step leading up to the pulpit, and he nearly fell. A heavy fist pounded against the church doors. Another and another. The undead were gathering outside. A blood-curdling scream shattered the silence as one of the creatures lunged forward, tackling a man in the pews. Flesh tore. Blood sprayed across the marble floor. Calloway swung the heavy brass cross from the altar, smashing it into the deacon's skull. The impact split rotten flesh, sent teeth scattering across the floor. But Wilkes kept coming. Panicked, Calloway grabbed a burning candle and flung it at one of the creatures. Flames licked at its tattered clothing, but it didn't flinch. The doors burst open. The horde poured inside. Calloway turned and ran. He fled past the pews, past the desperate hands reaching for him, toward the back door of the church. The holy ground had failed them. As he shoved through the door and into the cold, endless night, the last thing he heard was the chorus of screams and snapping bones behind him. The dead had taken the house of God, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Tyler Nash had no intention of stopping in this town. He was just passing through, a drifter with nowhere to be and no one waiting for him. He had a quarter tank of gas, a pack of cigarettes, and a trunk full of things he'd rather not explain. But the darkness, that was something he couldn't ignore. He hadn't seen daylight in over 15 hours. His phone was dead. The highway was empty. Not a single car had passed him since he'd crossed into town. That alone was enough to tell him something was wrong. And then came the voices, low, distant whispers from the roadside. At first he thought it was the wind, but the longer he drove, the more distinct they became, hushed, urgent, almost pleading. Then he saw the first one, a man, no, what had been a man, standing in the middle of the road, arms dangling at his sides, head tilted at an unnatural angle. His skin looked too tight, his mouth torn open in a silent, agonized grin. Tyler slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop just feet from the figure. His heart pounded as he gripped the wheel, breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing twitched. Its head snapped toward him, and that was all it took. Tyler jammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as he backed away. But before he could put it into drive, more figures emerged from the roadside, dozens of them. He cursed, spun the wheel hard, and peeled off down a side road. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The road narrowed. winding between dense trees. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the pavement. He didn't see the spike strip until it was too late. The tires exploded. The car fishtailed before slamming into a ditch. Tyler's head cracked against the steering wheel. Pain erupted behind his eyes as he fumbled with the seatbelt. The whispers were closer now. A hand slammed against the window. Tyler screamed and kicked the door open, tumbling onto the wet ground. He scrambled to his feet just as the first of them reached him. He ran. Branches slashed his arms and face as he tore through the woods. He could hear them behind him, groaning, snarling, never stopping. His lungs burned. His legs screamed for rest. A clearing appeared ahead, a lone building, dark and silent, a barn. Without thinking, he sprinted inside and slammed the door shut behind him. The silence was deafening. His breaths came in sharp gasps. He pressed his back against the door, heart hammering. Then slowly, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Something breathed from the shadows. A shudder ran down his spine. He turned, just enough to see the massive shape lurking in the rafters. The thing hanging from the beams, waiting, watching. Then it dropped. A dreadful hiss slithered through the darkness, echoing off the barn walls. Tyler's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. A hunched, unnatural figure, its outline barely visible in the gloom. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and insect-like. And then two glinting eyes snapped open, locking onto him. The barn was no refuge. It was a trap, and Tyler was no match for the abomination approaching from the dark. Lena Monroe tightened her grip on the baseball bat, her knuckles white as she stared out the living room window. The darkness outside was suffocating, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The power had gone out hours ago, and the only light in the house came from the flickering candles on the coffee table. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching with the flame's movement, making the small room feel even smaller. Her husband, Eric, stood by the door, his rifle at the ready. Their two children, Molly and Ben, sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in blankets, their eyes wide with fear. "How much longer, Mom?" Molly whispered, her voice barely audible over the silence pressing in on them. Lena didn't have an answer. The night hadn't ended. It should have been morning by now, but the world outside remained trapped in endless blackness. The town had fallen silent, the screams from earlier replaced by an eerie stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made Lena's skin crawl. Eric exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the rifle. "I don't like this. We should have seen the sun by now. Something's wrong." A sudden thud against the front porch made them all freeze. Ben whimpered, burying his face in his sister's shoulder. Lena raised the bat, swallowing the lump in her throat. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate dragging across the wooden steps, like something being pulled along the floorboards. Eric stepped forward, motioning for Lena to stay back. He unlatched the door but didn't open it, peering through the peephole instead. His body tensed. "Shit." Lena's stomach dropped. "What?" Eric turned, his face pale. "It's Greg." Lena rushed to the door and pressed her eye to the peephole. Greg Simmons, their neighbor, stood on the porch, swaying slightly. He was barefoot, wearing only a tattered bathrobe. His skin was wrong, gray, sunken, as if he had been dead for days. His mouth hung open, drool mixing with something dark that leaked from his lips. His eyes were gone, replaced with deep, black pits. Then he moved. His head twitched violently, snapping in their direction as if sensing them through the door. A horrible gurgling sound came from his throat before he slammed his head against the wood. "Oh my God," Lena whispered. "Greg, he was fine yesterday." "That's not Greg anymore," Eric muttered. "Get the kids upstairs, now." Lena hesitated, but the next sound made the decision for her. From the darkness beyond the porch, more moans rose, more footsteps, more bodies. Shadows moved at the edge of the lawn, dozens of them. The air grew thick with the sound of dragging feet and wet, rattling breaths. Some of them whispered, a low, indecipherable murmur that made the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stand up. "They're coming," Eric said. "Go." Lena grabbed the children and hurried up the stairs, their tiny hands clutching at her arms. As she reached the landing, a loud crash echoed below. Greg had thrown himself against the door, splintering the wood. Eric fired a shot. The gunshot rang through the house, but it didn't stop Greg. It didn't stop any of them. The front door burst open, the impact shaking the walls. The groans turned to frantic snarls, the sound of shuffling feet turning into a chaotic stampede. Lena barely had time to shove the kids into the bedroom and lock the door before she heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. They were inside. She pressed her ear against the door. Heavy footsteps pounded on the floorboards. Furniture crashed to the ground. A deep, sickening gurgle carried up the stairs. And then, silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, wrong. Eric's voice called from downstairs, breathless. "Lena, it's okay. You can come out." She froze. Something in his tone was off. Too calm, too controlled. Molly clutched her arm. "Mom?" Lena's heart pounded. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The silence stretched on, pressing against her ears like a heavy weight. Then came the whisper, "Open the door, sweetheart." It sounded like Eric, but it wasn't him. Lena clenched her teeth, gripping the bat tighter. The kids held onto her, their bodies trembling. She glanced toward the window. The darkness outside was endless, but somewhere beyond it, there had to be hope. A way out. A second chance. She just had to make a choice. As the doorknob began to turn. Dr. Evelyn Carter sat in the dim glow of her monitors, her fingers trembling as she typed. The research lab had gone into emergency lockdown 6 hours ago, but that hadn't stopped the horror from creeping closer. The steel-reinforced walls were meant to protect against chemical leaks to biological threats. Not this. Her hands ached. She had typed and deleted the same sentence 3 times. There is no rational explanation for what is happening outside the reinforced observation window. The world was steeped in permanent night. The security cameras showed the streets littered with bodies, some unmoving, others twitching, shifting as if waiting for something. The airwaves had gone silent. No emergency broadcasts, no military intervention, just darkness and the slow, methodical movement of the dead. And yet the town still pulsed with something, a force, a presence. Evelyn exhaled, steadying her nerves. She had spent her entire career searching for explanations, studying disease, unraveling biological mysteries. There is always an answer. But this was different. This was something outside of science. She turned to the glass containment chamber at the far end of the lab. The body inside twitched, fingers curling against the metal restraints. Its skin had turned the sickly gray of a corpse. Veins blackened beneath the surface. Its mouth hung open, lips moving as if speaking words Evelyn couldn't hear. She grabbed the recorder from her desk, pressing record. Subject remains unresponsive to all known stimuli, she whispered. Brain activity is erratic, oscillating between complete dormancy and bursts of neural activity. The subject's body has suffered significant decomposition, yet it remains aware. The figure in the chamber jerked, its head snapping in her direction. Evelyn flinched. It was watching her. Number that wasn't possible. The thing was dead, and yet its lips moved faster, forming silent words. Its sunken eyes, black pits of nothingness, seemed to see her in a way that made her stomach twist. She turned to the audio spectrogram, analyzing the air in the chamber. The system picked up a faint, undetectable frequency, a sound below human hearing, a whisper. She adjusted the gain. The spectrogram pulsed violently. There was something embedded in the silence. Evelyn's breath hitched. My God, it's not just movement. They're communicating. The whispering grew louder. Then the lab's emergency lights shut off. A cold realization settled in her gut. They know I'm listening. Her screen flickered, and the containment chamber unlocked. Evelyn spun, heart slamming against her ribs as the creature inside the chamber took a single, deliberate step forward. It wasn't just looking at her anymore. It was smiling. A deep, rattling breath filled the chamber. Evelyn didn't wait. She bolted for the exit, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, the metallic groan of the containment door swinging open sent a cold shiver down her spine. The lab was in total darkness now, the backup generators too slow to kick in. She had seconds to get out. Her shoes pounded against the tile as she ran down the narrow corridor, her pulse hammering in her ears. The emergency stairwell was ahead. If she could just make it down to the sub-level, she could find another way out. Then she heard it. A hiss. Low, wet closer than it should have been. She whirled around. The shadows at the end of the hallway moved, shifting unnaturally, like something was crawling toward her. But she couldn't see it, only hear it. Click, click, click. The sound of nails or bone dragging along the walls. Evelyn bit back a scream and threw herself into the stairwell, slamming the door behind her. The thick metal barely muffled the sound of something scraping against it. Heart pounding, she hurried down the stairs, nearly slipping in her panic. The emergency sub-level had old storage rooms, a break area, a security checkpoint. Somewhere, anywhere, she could hide. A small door loomed ahead, janitor's closet. She yanked it open and ducked inside, pressing herself against the farthest wall. In the suffocating darkness, she covered her mouth, forcing herself to breathe as quietly as possible. Outside, the stairwell door groaned open. Something stepped inside. She squeezed her eyes shut as the whispers started again, curling inside her head like writhing fingers. We see you. Evelyn bit down hard on her lip to keep from screaming. She didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, silence. The presence outside the door waited. Seconds passed, then minutes, then the sound of footsteps retreating. Evelyn let out a slow, shaky breath, barely daring to believe it. For now, she was safe, but she knew this wasn't over, not even close. Jake Cooper's lungs burned as he ran, his boots crunching against the shattered remnants of a once bustling town. He had no idea where he was going. All he knew was that he had to move. The whispers were everywhere now, an insidious pulse that seemed to vibrate through his skull, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. The town was wrong. That was the only way he could describe it. The streets stretched on endlessly, looping in a way that defied logic. No matter which direction he took, he always ended up back near the gas station, back to the place where he'd first seen the creatures. They wouldn't let him leave. His breath came in ragged gasps, as he ducked into a half-collapsed storefront, pressing his back against the wall. He clenched his pistol. Only 3 bullets left. It wouldn't be enough. Not for what was out there. His radio crackled. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. The radio had been dead since this nightmare started. He grabbed it from his belt, pressing the button with trembling fingers. "This is Officer Cooper," he whispered. "Is anyone out there? Repeat, is anyone out there?" Static. Then, "They see you." Jake froze. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, shifting, like multiple people speaking at once. A deep, warbling distortion that made his teeth ache. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the radio cut out. A new sound filled the air. Footsteps. Jake flattened himself against the wall, holding his breath. Through the shattered windows, he saw them. Figures moving down the street, their shapes grotesque in the moonless dark. Some still looked human, staggering as though their bodies were resisting something unnatural. Others had changed. Their limbs were wrong, too long, their faces a mess of stretched, gnashing teeth and hollow black eyes. They moved with a disturbing purpose. They weren't searching blindly, they were hunting. Jake gritted his teeth. He had to keep moving. Staying in one place was a death sentence. He slipped out the back, careful to avoid making noise. The alley was damp, the smell of rot clinging to the air. Trash cans lay overturned, their contents spilled onto the pavement. A door stood at the far end of the alley, rusted but unlocked. He pushed it open, stepping into what looked like an old mechanic's garage. A flickering work light cast eerie shadows over the grease-stained floor. Tools lay scattered, as if someone had left in a hurry. And in the center of the room, a map. Jake stepped closer, his heart hammering. Someone had scrawled across it in frantic, messy handwriting. "They come from the dark. They don't stop. They don't think, but they remember." Jake's fingers tightened around the edges of the map. Below the warning, there was a marked location, circled in red. An abandoned radio tower on the outskirts of town. A possible way out. A sharp click behind him. Jake spun, raising his pistol. Lena Monroe stood in the doorway, a shotgun aimed at his chest. But she wasn't alone. 2 small figures stood behind her, wide-eyed and silent. Her children, Molly and Ben. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lena let out a shaky breath. "You're not one of them." Jake slowly lowered his weapon. "Neither are you." Lena's hands were trembling, her face pale, but her eyes, they held something deeper. A grief Jake recognized. "I saw your house," he said carefully. "Eric." Lena's jaw tightened. She took a slow breath. "He didn't make it. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to keep speaking. "He turned." Jake swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Molly clutched at her mother's arm, her small fingers curling into Lena's sleeve. "Mommy made him go away," she whispered. Lena's face twisted with something Jake couldn't quite place. Guilt, horror, and something else. Resolve. "We didn't have a choice," Lena murmured. "We ran when it happened. I got them out. That's all that matters." Jake nodded. He knew better than to ask for details. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Lena took a deep breath and straightened. "We need to move." Jake took one last look at the map, then shoved it into his pocket. They had a plan, but the night was far from over. The survivors had found each other through sheer luck and desperation. Jake had stumbled upon Lana and her children first, hiding inside an abandoned general store, their eyes wild and hollowed by exhaustion. He had expected her to be broken, defeated, but she was still fighting, still holding on. Then, by some miracle, they had found Evelyn holed up in an old roadside diner, scribbling frantic notes by candlelight, still searching for an explanation even as the darkness swallowed the town whole. Now they stood together at the outskirts of town, in the shell of an old auto repair shop. It was the only place that felt remotely safe. 4 concrete walls, no windows, and a rusted roll-up door that groaned every time it moved. They had blocked the entrance as best they could, piling old tires and tool chests against it, but they all knew it wouldn't hold forever. The town itself was alive, restless, watching. They had no food, no radio signal, no chance of rescue. They only had fire. "We have to burn it," Jake said finally. His voice was hoarse, heavy with exhaustion. "All of it. If we leave it standing, whatever this is, it'll spread. It won't stop here." Lena inhaled sharply but nodded. "How?" "We don't have enough firepower to take down an entire town." Evelyn pulled something from her pack, several canisters of industrial-grade accelerant she had taken from the lab before it fell. "We do now." Jake raised an eyebrow. "That stuff's unstable. We'd have to be careful." Evelyn gave a humorless chuckle. "We passed careful a long time ago." The plan was simple, but it would take all of them to pull it off. They moved through the ruined streets in silence, dousing buildings, overturned cars, and the bodies that littered the sidewalks with accelerant. They worked quickly, the whispers growing louder with every second, pressing into their skulls like unseen fingers. Some of the creatures still moved in the distance, standing at the edges of alleys, watching, waiting. They did not charge. They did not moan. They only stared, as if they knew. Jake struck the first match. The small flame flickered against the windless night. He let it fall onto a pool of accelerant, and the fire raced outward, consuming everything in its path. Flames erupted from storefronts and houses, climbing high, licking at the sky like hungry hands. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning flesh and wood. Then the screaming began, not from the creatures, from the town itself. The whispers turned into an agonized wail, an unnatural warping sound that sent ice down their spines. The ground shuddered beneath them, cracks forming in the pavement, as if the town was alive and dying all at once. Molly screamed, clutching Lena's arm. "Mommy, we have to go!" Jake grabbed Lena's shoulder. "It's working. We need to move, now." They ran. The fire followed, swallowing the town in a wave of orange and red. The streets seemed to shift beneath them, stretching, warping, trying to pull them back. The town didn't want to let them go. Evelyn tripped. Jake yanked her to her feet, just as a blackened hand shot from the ground where she had fallen. It clawed at empty air, twitching, shriveling in the heat. They did not stop running. By the time they reached the road leading out of town, the fire had engulfed everything behind them. The entire horizon was ablaze. The whispers had become a distant hum, a final echo of something that had existed for far too long. And then, silence. They didn't stop until they reached the next ridge, miles away. Only then did they dare to turn around. The town was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a smoldering pit, an unnatural darkness still hanging above it, as though the sky itself refused to reclaim the space. Lena tightened her grip on her children, pressing a kiss to their foreheads. Evelyn wiped the sweat and soot from her face, staring blankly at the ruins. Jake exhaled, his fingers still curled around his pistol, though there was no longer a need for it. "Is it over?" Ben whispered. No one answered. They watched for a long time, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the ruins. Nothing did. At last, Jake turned away. "Come on, he said. "We keep moving." The survivors walked into the unknown, leaving the town and the nightmare behind. But none of them could shake the feeling that somewhere in the ashes, something was still watching.